Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the System of Care Learning Series. Give me just a second while I get everything on my screen set. Not sure what happened there with the recording, but let's try this again. Okay, my name is Lee Taylor, and I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things before we get started this morning. Our session today is in Zoom webinar. That means that all attendees are muted and your videos are off. We are recording the session and will make the recording available soon. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen for questions. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. ASL interpreters will be on screen throughout the session. You can change your view at the top portion of your screen. You can select the side-by-side gallery views so that you can see the presenter as well as the slideshow and the ASL interpreters. We are also using captioning this morning. If you do not see that on your screen, you can click the CC button at the bottom. We know that there may be technical difficulties, and we appreciate your patience if we encounter any this morning. So here's the slide for anyone that is wanting continuing education credit or certificates of attendance. You must be in the content portion of the webinar for at least 90% of the session to be eligible for a certificate. This is a mandate from the boards. Please do not leave the webinar until the conclusion of the Q&A, as that counts as part of the session. You do not have to enter your contact information in the chat, though you're welcome to if you just want to network with your friends. Attendees and their times attendance is tracked by Zoom. And also, you must use the same email address to register for each learning series event. If you use your work email to register and you're using your phone or your personal laptop, as long as you clicked on that link that was sent to your work email, you'll be fine. The important thing is using the same email address. Don't switch back and forth between your work and personal for registering. That's really important if you want a certificate of attendance or CEs. In the coming weeks, you'll receive an email from me that will provide a link to access the session evaluation and then your certificate. You must complete the session evaluation to proceed to the certificate. There's a screenshot to show you the landing page for the evaluations and certificates. Lastly, you're responsible for printing your own certificate. We do not mail or email these anymore. The website houses several years of the System of Care Academy and Now Learning series. So if you lose your certificate, you can access this website to print another. And just to repeat, I will not send the evaluation link today. It'll come in a few weeks. And now let's learn about our presenter. James Campbell has been working professionally in the human services field for over 25 years. His passion is helping individuals, families, and relationships to heal through leveraging their strengths and supporting other helping professionals as they cultivate their skills and expertise to assist others more effectively. James is a licensed professional counselor, licensed addiction counselor, master addictions counselor, and an advanced alcohol and drug counselor. He is also a member of both the AADC and ACA. James is the immediate past president of the Addiction Professionals of South Carolina and has worked in a wide range of clinical settings over the years. Currently, he serves as the Training and Technical Assistant Manager for the Southeast Addiction Technology Transfer Center, located at the National Center for Primary Care at Morehouse School of Medicine. And he works privately as a nationally recognized author, consultant, professional, and speaker. Welcome back to Kentucky, James.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back, and I'm looking forward to today's training. I will go ahead and jump in and pull up slides and get underway. But I want to begin by saying I really appreciate the Kentucky Systems of Care putting on this training series. I really appreciate you taking time out today to join. And my goal for the end of the day is for you to have a better understanding of addiction recovery from a holistic perspective, and some ways to consider moving from one to the other. How do we really help people to move from that active addiction to a vibrant and sustainable recovery? That's always my heart and my goal in this training. That said, I will go ahead and go on record as saying that I actually have that whole biography, and it's all nice. But the real reason that I'm here is because I love this work that we have the opportunity to do. I love working with people. I love working with people who struggle with alcohol and drug disorders. And I love helping see those people move from that active addiction into recovery. My heart is in this work. And I always say it this way. If your heart is not in this work, then I would politely ask that you consider moving your behind to where your heart is. That's not meant to be mean or crass. It's just the truth is that if your heart's not in this work, those you serve already know it. They can smell hypocrisy at 100 yards. You're not doing them favors if you're serving someone that you don't care about or that you're not passionate about serving. Also, it's your life. You have 168 hours a week. Why would you invest 40 plus of those into doing something that you don't really care about, that you're not really passionate about? So my hope is that today, the people who are on this session, the people who are on the line, are the people who really are invested, who have a heart and a passion for this work, and are enjoying working to make a difference. Gratitude is one of the things that is key in my own life, and I think having gratitude for the opportunity to serve those that we do, even on the hard days, is important. Of course, we have to have learning objectives in order to get CEs, and so we always include those. I don't read those to you verbatim, but again, my hope is that by the end of the day, we have a better holistic understanding of addiction, a better understanding of why just focusing on the addiction side is not in itself as effective, and what we could focus on instead, and some steps to help people move from point A to point B. Also, if there are certain things that you want to get out of today, I encourage you to put those in the chat. If those do pop up, by all means, we'll take some time to answer questions at the end. If there are things that are pertinent to what's on the screen at the moment, if need be to interrupt, by all means, feel free. And I'm glad to follow up with that as well. If Lee or the others would like to chime in with those, that's certainly fine. Otherwise, I will look forward to answering questions at the end. So what is addiction? You kind of have to start with that question, I think, in some regards. And for some, this question may seem familiar. Like if we ask the average person in your community to describe, quote, an addict to us, what are some of the things they would be likely to say? Now, here I'm not asking what you think as a professional. I'm not asking you from a human services standpoint or a recovery standpoint. I'm talking about the person who's beside you in the line at the grocery store, the person who's at your family reunion, the person who you pass on the street. If you were to ask them to describe a person with addiction to us, what are some of the things they'd be likely to say? If you don't mind, just take a second and put a few of those in the chat, and we'll see what you got. We'll see what you come up with.
Okay, James, this is what's coming in. One person said it's a choice. They can quit if they want to. Another person says negative things that are extremely judgmental to the person that is addicted. Someone said a choice.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Let's get a little more detailed. I think you're on the right track. What might they say they look like? What might they say are some traits? If you looked at a person or were around a person with addiction, how might you know?
They choose drugs over family, a preference, dope heads, jobless, weak, lazy, low income, homeless, like a bum living under a bridge, skid row, dirty, no good for nothing, dirty, homeless, poor, exhausted, older, living off the government, thieves, looks older than their age with no teeth.
Wow. The reason I know that you and I know some of the same people is that I made this slide before I asked you that question. Oftentimes when you ask someone to describe a person with addiction to you, or what does a person with addiction look like, this is a lot of what you hear, that they have a co-occurring disorder, they're self-medicating, they're the person at the four-way stop who's tapping on your windshield, they're criminals, they're homeless, they have poor hygiene, or bad oral hygiene, or bad teeth, they're emaciated, they're thin, Sometimes people throw racial stereotypes into that mix as well. You get all these different points of view and perspectives in terms of what a person with addiction is or what a person with addiction looks like. Unfortunately, the things that are on your screen right now have very little to do with addiction. And what I mean by that is there are people who fit all of those categories who don't struggle with addiction, who meet all those criteria on the screen, who don't have an addiction at all. And there's probably less than 1% of people with a substance use disorder who fall into those categories. What you're talking about is a extreme far end of a continuum. That's problematic for a number of reasons that we'll get into as we go as well. Just suffice it for now to say the things on your screen really aren't the symptoms of addiction. It's just the general population's idea of what a person with addiction is like. And I often will ask, does that stereotype, do those things that we just put up there, do they describe most of you or your clients? And typically people go, well, no, it doesn't describe me or my clients or my family in most cases. And so I'll say, well, okay, I got you. That doesn't really describe you. It doesn't really describe your clients. And the idea is that it gives you a false sense of security. Well, if I am not this, then clearly I'm okay. I don't have a substance use disorder. And so it keeps a lot of people who could benefit from getting services from ever showing up for services. They just don't think that they need them. It keeps people out of the loop of getting treatment, getting recovery services, etc. So today we'll talk about addiction for a little bit as a lifestyle-related health problem. Now we're going to go through this section pretty quickly because I want to get to the meat of the conversation today, but I think it's important to lay this groundwork so that we're all sort of speaking a same language, if you will. To talk about a lifestyle-related health problem, I'm actually not going to start out talking about addiction at all. I find that sometimes when you start out talking about addiction, people already have preconceived notions. So I oftentimes will engage talking about heart disease or something similar to that. And in the case of heart disease, most people would say, if you ask, does it have a genetic predisposition? Does it run in families? People go, well, yes, it runs in families. Absolutely. So it has a genetic predisposition. If you go to your general practitioner's office, they will oftentimes hand you a sheet of paper with about 300 boxes on it. And it says, does anyone in your immediate family has this? And it'll list cancer and diabetes and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and all sorts of things. But the reason those things are there, the reason they ask is because they know that there's a genetic predisposition involved. Now, it's not a genetic predestination. In other words, just because someone in your family has heart disease doesn't mean you have to develop it. It just means you're more likely to. That the genetic deck is stacked against you, so to speak. But we also know that heart disease involves choices that we make, choices that are impacted by social influences, by psychological influences. For instance, if I have a history of heart disease in my family, but I decide to eat out 5 times a week and supersize it every time and pay the dollar for the milkshake, that can be problematic. That may not necessarily help my heart disease predisposition. And when we say that choices are impacted by social influences, that includes a few different things. For instance, it includes where you live in the country. We live in the Southeast where we will deep fry anything. We'll deep fry an Oreo, a Twinkie, you name it, we'll deep fry it. So that's a social influence. Also think about marketing. Think about how much a 15-second Super Bowl ad costs. So when you have a restaurant or something like that that is advertising during the Super Bowl, they are literally banking on the fact that they can impact your choices based on social influences. Well, next time you get hungry and you have an idea of where to go, you may want to consider where that social influence came from. It also includes psychological influences, which really just means what we believe. If I believe the only people who eat salad belong on the West Coast, if I believe that the only time you should ever run is if a really big dog is chasing you, if that's really my belief system, that's probably going to impact my behavior, which in turn is going to really impact the likelihood of me developing heart disease. And when biology and choices meet, there are often predictable outcomes. So if I say to somebody, hey, I have a history of heart disease in my family. I had several uncles who died under the age of 55 with a heart attack or something along those lines. I eat out multiple times a week, lots of high fat, high salt foods. Exercise fascinates me. I could watch it for hours, but I'm not going to participate in it. Who wants to do that? If those things are all true about me, and I asked, could I develop heart disease? Most times people would say, yeah, you could. And if I say, if those things were true about you, could you develop heart disease? Most of the time they will say, well, yeah, I mean, it's possible I could. If, however, I turn around and ask those same people, could you develop an addiction? More often than not, they will say, no, I couldn't. And when I ask them why, the answer I get most often is, uh, I'm not that kind of person, which I always find a little bit baffling. We've been talking about biology and we're talking about physiology, and now they're talking about what kind of person they are. So there's definitely still a strong moralistic component to how addiction is viewed, how people conceive it, how people conceptualize it. That's still very much steeped in the way that most people view it. So if we're going to come at it from the perspective that addiction is a disease, then we have to really make the case for that. The general population doesn't necessarily believe that. And what I find is even among people who work in this profession, they say that they believe that addiction is a disease, but they don't always necessarily carry that out in terms of how they actually conduct themselves, the language that we use, and a host of other things. If we're going to call it a disease, sadly, they don't let me make it up. I actually have to go to the American Medical Association and look at their definition to see if addiction does, in fact, meet the criteria. What they said is that if something's going to be considered a disease, it has to have a cause. Like we may or may not know the cause, but it has to have one. Like when HIV and AIDS first started out or first started being discovered, we didn't know what was causing it. They were actually some really outlandish ideas about what caused it. But there had to be some kind of cause if it was, in fact, a disease. It has to have symptoms. How do we know that we have it? If we have a stomach bug, a virus, how do we know we have that? Well, there's some pretty distinctive symptoms that tell us that that might be the case. A prognosis. What happens if it's treated? What happens if it's not treated? Those have to be present in order for something to be considered a disease. In addition, it may have a treatment. Now, that's not a guarantee. Again, in the early days of HIV/AIDS, if you think about Ebola, if you think about COVID, in the very beginning, we may not know how to treat something. We don't know necessarily what's most effective for that. And it may be chronic and it may not be chronic. Chronic just means that it's something you manage, not something that you cure or get rid of. When we say that it's chronic, the question is it something that we're able to knock out quickly, like say a sinus infection with an antibiotic, or is it something that we're really going to be managing over the course of time that usually takes a lot longer to set in? So let's take a look at whether or not addiction meets those criteria, and we'll go through this again fairly quickly. Well, when you talk about the cause of addiction, you tend to get two camps. You tend to get the nature people and you get the nurture people. The nature people are the people who talk about genetics and they talk about epigenetics. They talk about family history. They have those little check boxes like we were talking about at the doctor's office. Sometimes they do genograms with the squares and the circles and drawing lines and all that sort of thing. Those are the nature people. They're very much interested in the physiology of it, that aspect. On the other side of that equation are the nurture people. And the nurture people are really more of a social learning bent. These are folks who say, no, it's your environment, it's what you grow up in, it's what you see. It might be what kind of trauma you go through, but it really is impacted more environmentally than it is through genetics. And when I first came into this profession, I have to tell you, I was like almost as far on the nurture side of that equation as you can imagine. I really didn't have much time or interest in the nature side. And to be frank, part of my rationale for that was I thought, if I can't change it, like if I can't change my genetics, why invest a lot of time and energy worrying about it? Why don't we focus on the nurture side? It made more sense to me that if I grew up in a household where when my dad got stressed out, he had a beer or 12, And I see that modeled for me. When I get older and I get stressed out, well, I know how to deal with that. There's a coping skill that I've seen modeled. Let me take that task. Let me take that track. That made a lot of sense to me. The problem is that I was arguing pretty passionately and debating within the treatment community for the nurture side of the equation. But I was also reading a lot of research. And probably the most compelling research I came across was a study that was done by Oxford University with identical twins who were adopted at birth. These twins who were adopted at birth were followed over the course of 50 years. And the bottom line of that whole study was, if a person was born to a biological parent with an addiction, even if they didn't live with them a single day of their life, they were 4 times more likely to struggle with addiction. I hate when research contradicts what I want to believe, but here it was. That really does not help out my nurture argument very much. Now, if you've been in a long-term relationship, you'll be able to relate to this. Have you ever found yourself arguing hard or passionately for a cause, and you realize about halfway through that maybe you're losing and maybe your position isn't the best one, but you're not done arguing yet? That's kind of where I found myself. I was reading this research, but I wasn't done arguing. I was still very much committed to the nurture side of the equation. And when you find yourself passionately arguing for a position that is losing, it is a good idea to pause and ask yourself, why am I arguing so hard? For me, it only took about 15 minutes to figure that out. I have a daughter and I have a son, and addiction is rampant in my family. If nature is true, that's really disconcerting. But if nurture is true, then maybe, just maybe, I could be a good enough father to outparent addiction. Maybe I could get them involved in sports. Maybe I could get them involved in music. Maybe I could be really supportive and nurturing, have that after school special talk at exactly the right time, involve them in DARE or just say no or the new variants thereof. There's all these things that I need to consider doing. Now, let me be clear. Those things do have some value for the most part. They're definitely protective factors when you talk about having supportive adults in your life and things of that nature. They're protective factors. They help cultivate some resiliency, but they're not a vaccine. And the reality is that genetically speaking, because addiction is rampant in my family, the genetic deck in my family is stacked. And if my kids choose to use alcohol or they choose to use other drugs, they are indeed running a much higher risk of struggling with addiction. I also say that in working with families, it's important to point out to families some of the most wonderful, amazing, supportive parents I have ever seen have children who struggle with addiction. And some of the worst, most abusive and neglectful families I have ever seen, or caregivers I've ever seen, have children who never struggle with addiction. So unfortunately, the nurture side by itself simply doesn't carry out. The other side of that equation is neither does the nature side. The cause of addiction is neither nature nor nurture. The cause of addiction, the number one predictor of whether someone's going to struggle with addiction over the course of their lifetime, is dose and frequency. How much do they use? How often? That's the number one predictor. And even if there's no family history, if you use enough of a drug over a long enough time, you will develop an addiction. And once you develop it, if you have children after that, you will then pass along that predisposition for addiction. Now, the other side of that equation that often gets overlooked is actually after 2 generations of sobriety, you actually cease to pass along the predisposition to addiction. So I can't say that you inherit or you pass along a trait for recovery. But what I can say is that if a person gets into recovery and it stays that way in the generation after them does, they cease to pass down the predisposition for addiction, which is pretty amazing. Like, I love that fact. So a lot of the things that you just heard, you may have heard other places before. You may have heard them through Prime for Life or other educational kind of programs. For me, when I got to a certain point in my career, I felt like I had all these different points, all these different puzzle pieces of what addiction was, and they didn't all line up. I had, from the recovery side, I heard about a spiritual program. On the biological side, I heard about MAT and genetic studies and things of that nature. On the psychological side, I learned about people who may have co-occurring disorders, people who have commingling disorders, what that looks like. On the social side, it was social learning, what was your environment like, etc. In experience, I learned about the risk for trauma, the risk with adverse childhood experiences, things of that nature. So I felt like I had all these pieces about addiction. And I encountered the gentleman whose picture is on your screen now, a gentleman named Jeff Georgi. And he, for the first time, when he presented the model that's on the screen now, gave me the puzzle box to help put all those pieces together. I owe a debt of gratitude to him. He is a friend and a colleague and a mentor. And so I definitely want to acknowledge that some of where we're going during this time comes directly from him. What he said is that it wasn't any one of those things, it was a combination of those things. That if we have a biological vulnerability, a psychological liability, a social isolation, spiritual bankruptcy, and we add to that experience, particularly the experience of use, then that has a predictable outcome of addiction. Now, it's important that you understand that, because right now there's sort of a pushback. For a long time, people talked about the disease of addiction, and now actually there's some push on that. Gabor Mate and some others have talked about it. No, it's not really being a disease in the same way, or the disease model is insufficient. I agree that it's not sufficient. It is involving all of these different aspects, but this is a way of really beginning to pull those things together. So I'm going to walk through this model kind of quickly to give you that holistic, hopefully, puzzle box so that you see how the pieces fit. And then we're going to talk about what do you do with that, or where do we go with it? So when we talk about the biology of addiction, I start out really simply with the idea that addiction is a brain disease. And we'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. First, I want to make sure that you have a little working knowledge of the brain itself. I find that even though we work in this profession, most people don't have a lot of knowledge about the brain and how it works. So this is just a basic primer on your brain. If you're not a biology person, don't be scared. You're good company. The worst grade I made in my entire collegiate career at any point was biology. And irony of ironies, it's what I spend about 70% of my time training on now. First of all, I never go wrong starting with a little humility. If anybody tells you that they understand how the brain works, they understand everything about the human brain and how it works, I'm going to encourage you not to walk, but to run in the opposite direction. We do not know everything about the human brain works. I dare say there's a lot more that we don't know than that we do. Fortunately, we do know a lot more than we once did. We have PET scans, we have SPECT scans, we have MRIs, the ability to measure neurotransmitters. We have a lot of different abilities that we did not used to have. So I'm going to share a few things with you about your brain and how it works, and then we're going to apply it, because I'm not a theorist. At heart, I'm a clinician. So I want to know, so what? What do you do with some of that? And we'll get there in just a moment. First of all, our best estimate is that there's about 86 billion neurons in the human brain. That's billion with a B. Between each of those neurons is a synapse, or a space, and there's multiple neurotransmitters moving back and forth across that space from neuron to neuron at any given time. To think that we understand how all that works is really just disingenuous. We don't. We have theoretical models of how that turns into a memory, and how that memory then might activate emotion and all those sorts of things. But they really are kind of working models more than they are hard, nailed down physiology. Now, our brains weigh about 2% of our body weight, which means if you weigh about 150 pounds, your brain probably weighs about 3 pounds. If you weigh about 200 pounds, your brain's going to weigh about 4 pounds. But your brain burns about 25% of your total caloric intake. In other words, it's burning a lot of calories, about a quarter of them. In that sense, it's a very expensive organ for your body to run. Your body is diverting a lot of resources into making sure that the brain keeps running. That really makes a lot of sense because your brain has a very important function. In fact, it has two important functions that without which it would be a very short-lived existence. Our brains and everything that our brains do is really oriented toward helping us as individuals survive and helping the human race or the human species to survive. Everything our brain does is oriented toward one of those two tasks in one way or another. And it has two main systems of the brain. If you look in the center and you see what kind of where that swirl of colors is there in the center, that's the limbic system. The limbic system, the way I describe it, is as the gas pedal of the brain. It's what gets us up off the couch doing the things that we need to do in order to survive. So if you are hungry, it is your limbic system that tells you that. If you are thirsty, it is your limbic system that tells you that. We are in polite company, so I will say, if you have a desire to procreate and continue the species, that is a limbic system function. And the limbic system is not immoral, it is amoral. It doesn't care about right or wrong, it just wants whatever it wants. In other words, if you are a psychoanalyst, if you're from Freud's camp, the limbic system, physiologically speaking, is your id. It just wants whatever it wants. If you're diabetic and you see chocolate cake, your limbic system does not care about your diabetes. It just wants the chocolate cake. If you're in a committed relationship and you see someone you find very attractive, your limbic system does not care about your committed relationship. It just wants whatever it is that it wants. That is its function, is to get us up off the couch doing the things that help us and the human race to survive. Now, if all we had was the limbic system, we would be in a world of hurt. Fortunately, there's another system called the prefrontal cortex, and that's the part that's to your left above the eyebrows there. That is your brakes and your steering. In other words, the limbic system gets us up off the couch doing stuff, but the prefrontal cortex helps us figure out which things to do. It helps guide that process a little bit. If you ever find yourself thinking, on second thought, that's never the limbic system. The limbic system doesn't have a second thought. In fact, there's a great comedy routine about recovery and addiction. If you ever want to look up, it's called First Thought Wrong. That's kind of the gist of the limbic system. The limbic system just wants what it wants. It doesn't have a second thought. In fact, if it had a slogan, it would probably be Nike. It would be just do it, just immediately. I want whatever it is I want. So in the case of those two things working together to help us survive, the limbic system says we're hungry. We see the diet, or we see the chocolate cake rather, and the prefrontal cortex goes, but your blood sugar's a little high. Perhaps you should not eat that, or perhaps you should have a Diet Coke with it, or maybe you could have a salad tonight. It's not always exactly rational, but it's trying to navigate the world. Again, if you're psychoanalytic, your prefrontal cortex is doing the work of your ego, if you want to think of it that way. Now, the other thing our limbic system does is it's how we integrate the external world with who we are. It does that through our senses, and all five of the traditional senses run through that limbic system. It does that using three main parts, and you don't have to worry about the names. I'm not going to give you a test at the end, but I do want to just mention those three because we'll come back around to those in our discussion of addiction in just a moment. If you see those two green dots there, those are called amygdala. And I refer to those as being like the guard dog of the brain. In other words, they're sort of sitting on the porch, if you will, taking in information from all five senses, and they're scanning the environment. What they're scanning the environment for is anything that is relevant or salient to survival. That could be good relevant or bad relevant. So, if you're hungry and chocolate cake is there, that's good relevant. If that ferocious dog I was talking about running from earlier comes around the corner, that's also relevant to survival. So good or bad, it matters. It recognizes something as being good or bad because it has primitive memory. Your amygdala, through the senses, recognizes things as familiar and either has positive or negative responses to that. It'll give a little bump of dopamine when it recognizes something as relevant to survival. Now, just above the amygdala is an area called the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens, I call it the novelty alarm bell of the brain. In other words, novelty is what activates it. It only gives a bump of dopamine up when something is better or worse than anticipated. If it's exactly what you expected, it's sort of boring or exactly what you would expect, it doesn't really do much. But if something's better or worse than expected, it will then give a little bump of dopamine to that purplish curly cue that comes from underneath called the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus literally translates in Latin to seahorse. And if you look at the shape of it, you can kind of see that. And the hippocampus's job is to store things into memory, mainly over in our temporal lobes on the sides. It stores things over into our memory. And those things all work together. So in that regard, that's how we learn how to navigate the world around us. How do you know who has the best chicken sandwich in town? Well, you know that because at some point you were hungry and you saw a restaurant sign, or somebody told you about a restaurant, or you'd seen one of those social connections or social influence commercials. And so you stopped in, you ate it. Wow, you ate it and it was better than expected. Your nucleus accumbens gave a bump of dopamine and it filed it through your hippocampus and went, wow, we need to remember this so we can eat later and we can come back and find this again. Again, if you go back 200 years and you're wandering through the woods hungry and you find a bush with some berries that are blue on it and you eat them and they taste good and you don't get sick and you don't die, you need to remember where this bush is. It's really that same mechanism at work. But what about on the negative side? Same thing. It's how you know when you have to use the bathroom and you're driving across town, which gas stations you'll stop at and which ones you're like, I will take my chances. I'm just holding it. Because at some point you had to go to the restroom. You stopped at that gas station. You went in, and it looked like a bomb blew up in that rest area, and you thought, I am never coming back to this resting room again. That's not happening. It's how we learn to navigate the world around us. That is a physiological function. And we'll get into how that ties to addiction. At heart, the bottom line is that it's a brain disease, that addiction is indeed a brain disease. It meets the criteria that we mentioned earlier, and we will walk through some of those in a bit more detail. Again, if you want to just boil it down to its most basic and you don't want to walk through the whole lifestyle related health problem, let me give you like a 10,000 foot view. Health is you have an organ or organ system of the body. It functions as it should, and good stuff happens. We call that health. That's when all the organs are doing the things that they should be doing and life is good. If, however, we have an organ or organ system of the body and it functions otherwise, functions other than as it ideally would, bad things happen, and we call those symptoms. And then we look at those symptoms and figure out what the diagnosis is. That's sort of disease theory at its most basic. The problem is that it's not always viewed in the same way. So if I say to someone, my brother had a heart attack the other night. Well, again, we live in the Southeast, and so they will probably say, well, bless your heart, or bless his heart. They might put him on the prayer chain. They may even, if they're close, if they're pretty close kin or close family, they might bring in a casserole. You know, it's probably going to be filled with cheese and butter and salt and kill us quicker, but man, it'll taste great, won't it? They're very compassionate. If, however, the organ system involved happens to be the brain, what we find is that same level of compassion often is lacking. If I say to that same group of people, my brother attempted suicide the other night, or my brother had an overdose the other night, I'm going to probably get a fair amount of pushback on that. No, because we're polite, you know, we live in the South still, they will probably still say, bless your heart. They're probably not adding them to the prayer chain. And what you can almost count on is that casserole isn't coming. I wouldn't hold my breath waiting on it. In fact, they're probably not going to let their kids come over to my house to play. So there's still very much some stigma associated when the organ or organ system of the body that is impacted happens to be the brain. In other words, I'm not that kind of person. That thinking still creeps in. So how does that work? Now, this model I borrowed from a woman named Dr. Susan Holman. She was actually over Pavilion for many years in North Carolina. And the first time she explained this to me, it made a lot of sense. And so to me, when I talk about the biological side, this is a good spot to come from. And she said, Assume that an average person has a dopamine level of 10. Now, dopamine does several things, but generally speaking, it's associated with pleasure or saliency. Again, how relevant is this? How much attention do I need to pay to this? That's generally what that is. And the 10 is just an arbitrary number. It's just a made up number in order to have something to work with. And let's say they try cocaine. Essentially, without getting lost in the biology of it, cocaine keeps more dopamine in the synapse, that space between the neurons. It keeps more dopamine there so that as soon as one molecule is metabolized, there's another right there waiting to take its place. So when a person uses cocaine, the body reads as having a lot more dopamine in the brain, and so it feels good. It feels typically very euphoric. That person with a dopamine level of, and again, these are just made up numbers, but 18, with a 10 being natural and 8 being drug induced, feels euphoric, 10 foot tall and bulletproof. The problem is that the brain doesn't like it when things are out of whack. Your whole body doesn't like it when things are out of whack. I'm not sure what in whack means, but out of whack is bad. I've got that much, right? And so when it looks at that 18 and reads it as 18 of dopamine, the body says, we got too much dopamine. We need to back off production. So it backs off, let's say, down to an 8. The problem is that the cocaine then wears off. So your natural feeling on any given day was based on a 10 of dopamine. You just experienced euphoria at 18, and now you're at an 8. Now what's happening? Well, now you have the cocaine blues. You're not feeling great. You're tired. You want to pull the covers over your head and go back to bed. You're just not feeling so good. And essentially what you're talking about is physiologically, that's sort of the beginning of craving. You're just trying to get back to normal, trying to get back to feeling okay. It's that beginning of craving that gets reinforced over time. Well, since your body backed off, now at this point, there's good news and there's bad news. If the person does not use again, their body will bring them back up to a baseline dopamine of 10. If that was their baseline before, their body will bring them back to that. The problem is that takes delayed gratification, which isn't most of our best thing, if we're honest. If I had like the flu, the legitimate flu, not like the man flu, but the real flu, if I had the flu and you told me for $20 there was a pill that would fix it. I don't mean Tamiflu, going to make it a duration less. I mean, I take the pill and inside of 30 minutes, I'm going to feel better. I'm going to be better. Am I spending that $20? I can promise you I am. That's essentially where this person finds himself in a way. They normally felt at a 10, they just felt awesome at 18, and now they're not feeling great. But I felt awesome yesterday. I bet if I did that again, I would feel awesome again. So let's say that they do. Let's say that they use this same dose. They use the same potency of the drug, the same amount. And at this point, if it brings them back up 8 again, this time the problem is they started at 8. So what happens? Well, this time they're at a 16. Well, does the 16 still feel better than a 10? Yes, it definitely feels better than an 8, and it feels better than the normal 10. Does a 16 feel better than an 18? No. You are now chasing your first high. Already that early on in the process, you're chasing the first high. The problem is 16 is still too high. Your body goes, we have to back off production. So it does. And let's say it regulates down to a 6. Now that sort of follows that top line for a bit, but let's jump down to that middle row, if you will. What you're seeing evidence there is tolerance. That's sort of a nasty Mayweather 1-2 punch that you don't always see coming. Essentially, anything you use in large quantities in your body begins to view as poison and tries to get it out of your system as quickly as possible. And so I've been using the example of cocaine because with dopamine, that's just a really clean example, an easy one to use. But the truth is that every drug of misuse works on that same dopaminergic survival pathway in the brain. Some people call it a pleasure pathway. That's really a misnomer. It truly is oriented to our survival. Where do we find the berries? How do we avoid the nasty bathroom? It's really oriented to keep us alive. So in the case of, say, alcohol, If you are drinking a large amount of alcohol, your body goes, wow, there's a lot of that in here. We need to get more efficient at breaking that down. So it ups the enzyme in the liver that breaks down alcohol. It ups that amount, and we'll keep it up if we keep drinking. Eventually, that can cause some problems, as we know, with the liver, but it's getting more effective or more efficient at getting it out. So now not only are we having to outuse our own body and that natural number going down and the production going down, we're also having to outuse our tolerance. And the problem is that eventually leads to dopamine levels like 4s and 2s and 1s. The reason that's problematic is when you get to a level of a 4 or a 2 or a 1, your body doesn't interpret that as I'm having a bad day. Your body interprets that as I'm dying. Why is that an issue? Well, let me give you an example, not necessarily a very trauma-informed example. At the heart of the issue here is that your biology is now working against you. The organ of your body that is most oriented toward helping you survive and helping the species survive is now actually doing things that might lead us to die sooner. That's problematic. So oftentimes you will get that, isn't it just a choice? Again, we saw that in our stereotypes at the beginning when we're asking about what people would tell us. Isn't it just a choice, a question of willpower? Like Krispy Kremes, you know, I could eat a Krispy Kreme or not in theory. That's really not the best example. So let me give you a different example. And if you would put on like your forensic hat. So if some of you watch like First 48 Hours or Law and Order or CSI, this is your moment to shine, right? This is your moment to start your side work into evaluating forensic evidence. Let's say that I'm walking down by a pond or walking down by a lake, and I look over and lo and behold, there is a body face down in the water. And it's not like a pull it out, do CPR kind of a body. It's a, ooh, that's been there a minute, I need to call somebody kind of a body. So I call first response. They come out. Ultimately, they end up pulling the body from the water. And what they see is that there's a large lump on the back of the head. And they're trying to determine, did someone hit this person in the head and kill them, you know, blunt force trauma to the head, and just dump the body in the water? Or did maybe the person slip and bump their head? They were knocked out, they were unconscious, they fell into the water and drowned. So if what they want to know is, was this person alive when they went into the water? How do they determine that? Somebody in the chat tell me how they know.
Water in the lungs.
What do
Water
we
in the
got?
lungs. Water in the lungs.
Water.
We have a winner, folks. We have a winner. Whoever that is gets a gold star. They get the gold star for that. Absolutely, that is what it is. It's water in the lungs. Now, let me ask you a quick question, and this is why this is problematic. How many of you believe that you can breathe water? Like more than once, you can consistently breathe water? Not so much, huh? Hopefully not. I will give you this disclaimer. If you're working with adolescents, sometimes they're like, oh yeah, I knew this guy, you know, be mindful of that. But no, we don't think we can breathe water. So let me ask you a question. If we know we cannot breathe water, why would anybody in the history of the world that ever drowned have water in the lungs? We know we cannot breathe water. So why at any point would we breathe water into our lungs knowing it's just going to kill us and we're going to die from drowning? The answer to that question is, when survival is on the line, the limbic system overrides the prefrontal cortex. The problem with that is when we're at a 4 and a 2 and a 1 and our body interprets that as I am dying, in that moment, it doesn't matter what you promised your sponsor, what you promised your probation officer, your DSS or social worker, what you promised your counselor, what you promised your kids or your grandma. If that person, when they're at a 4 and a 2 and a 1, is confronted with the drug and they do not have any support around them, they're going to breathe it in, and it's going to have adverse effects over time. It's not a matter of that they don't mean it when they say, I'll never use again, like I'm done, I'm through. They mean it when they say it. The problem is a 4 and a 2 and a 1, even though it's not in their best interest, they use. That's why that support is so important. And we'll come around to that in just a moment. Now, before I move off of this, there is one other thing I want to point out that I think is pretty important. If you have a genetic predisposition toward addiction, your baseline dopamine level is probably not a 10. In fact, it's probably a 7 or a 6 or an 8. And so oftentimes for people who struggle with addiction, you will hear them say things like, I don't used to get high. I used to feel normal. Or, the first time I drank, the first time I snorted, or the first time I shot up was the first time I felt at home in my own skin. I felt like I belonged. And the truth of the matter is that can be easy to kind of roll past or to dismiss, but oftentimes that may be exactly their case if they do have that genetic predisposition. They've been a person who is at an 8 living in a world full of 10s. That's problematic. That's challenging. I'll also just let you know that some of the research that's happening now is taking a look at neurotransmitter levels and seeing if we can predict what somebody's primary drug would be. For instance, we were using dopamine for stimulants, and that is really probably the clearest one. But if you are naturally low in GABA, maybe you are more inclined to alcohol. Or if you have naturally lower cannabinoids, maybe you're more inclined to cannabis. And so that's some of what's being looked at as well. So it may be, we know that oftentimes using the language drug of choice is not really welcome. It's an antiquated term. It would be like going to your oncologist and them asking what your cancer of choice is. I don't have a cancer of choice. That doesn't work like that. Likewise, what we're finding is that the physiology or the neurotransmitter makeup of people's brain may be well, while one person tries methamphetamine and they're like, that didn't do anything for me. Or one person tries Oxycontin and they're like, man, I just went to sleep. That was nothing for me. And another person tries it and it's off to the races. So that's some of the research that's going on behind the scenes these days as well. So at this point, our biology is working against us. The bottom line takeaway of this, and this will be where we transfer out of the biology for a little bit. I know you're heartbroken. You love getting deep into the weeds of biology at before 10 a.m. The bottom line is that the energy of the addictive disease originates in the central core of the brain, in the limbic system, not in the prefrontal or the neocortex. Why does that matter? Because we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about thinking errors, irrational thoughts, stinking thinking, as though we can out-educate addiction. And it doesn't work. I could study about cancer for now until the end of my days, but I might still die from cancer. Knowledge in and of itself is not curative. It does give opportunity for change, opportunity for different decisions. But if we took a quick poll and said, how many people on this session today know that eating fast food is bad for you? We would probably all raise our hand. But if I then say, and how many of you have eaten it in the past 2 weeks? Most of us would probably raise our hand. It's not a question of education, and it's not a question of intelligence. It is a limbic system issue. One of the things the DSM-5 and now the TR got right is the inclusion of craving. That really is the heart of the matter. And so it's not that there isn't a place for talking about thought distortions and stinking thinking and all that in treatment. All I'm saying is that is only addressing one part of the brain and is not addressing the part of the brain where addiction actually resides. The example I use sometimes, if this is helpful for you, is if you're trying to win the Kentucky Derby, you're going to need a great jockey and you're going to need a great horse. You can't have one or the other. So in our analogy, if you think of the limbic system being this powerful thoroughbred, like this really strong, powerful horse, if you put me on that horse's back, we are not winning the Derby. I am no jockey. If, on the other hand, we have the greatest jockey in the world, but we have like a quarter horse or a mule, we're not going to win the Derby either. It's not really going to work like that. We're going to need both. Well, for a long time in treatment, we've been focused on the prefrontal cortex. We've been training the jockey, when the reality is we also need to be focused on how do we calm down the horse. That's emotional regulation. That may be some DBT skills. Again, there are lots of things that go into that. Again, I don't want to get lost in those weeds, but I did want to make that point. So when we talk about a biological vulnerability, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about basically our own genetic makeup. Again, the cause of addiction isn't the genetics. Having a genetic predisposition toward using and never using is like having a house that's been built and all the wires in the house are already in place, but it hasn't been hooked to the grid yet. When the person uses is when it throws the switch, if you will, and that becomes a significant issue. That is a biological vulnerability. And the other side of that is the vulnerability in terms of just how our brains work and how we learn, which is why anyone truly can become addicted. So back to our disease definition. It also has to have symptoms. Now, didn't we already talk about symptoms, right? Didn't we talk about symptoms? No, we did not. We talked about stereotypes of addiction, not the symptoms of addiction. In fact, when you look at the symptoms of addiction, we get those from the DSM, right? That's things like tolerance, about withdrawal, about unsuccessful attempts to cut back or to quit or giving up things that matter. The challenge is that symptoms are really easy to spot. Or I'm sorry, stereotypes are really easy to spot. Symptoms are not. And so the reality is people see these images and they think that's what addiction is. That's what a substance use disorder is. When the reality is 99% plus of people who struggle with a substance use disorder don't fit in any of these categories. You know from the DSM as well as I do that there are 11 total criteria, and whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, all falls into how many of those you have. But at its heart, the key takeaway from this is that these stereotypes of addiction keep people who could benefit from treatment and support from ever reaching out for it because they don't think they have a problem. So we have to be sure that we're really clear when we're talking to people the difference between those two. It has to have a
James,
prognosis. Now, when I first came into the profession, one of the things I was always taught was that addiction leads to institutions, incarcerations, graveyard. That was the three things I always heard. I actually altered that a little bit for myself, and it's not because it's Halloween or because I'm trying to be over dramatic. The prognosis of active addiction that is not interrupted is the graveyard. Now, the reason I say that and leave out institutions or leave out incarceration is because, unfortunately, I know a lot of people who go behind the fence into locked facilities and are still able to use while they're there. They either have means to make it, depending on what they're using, or somebody is bringing it in. And if a person's in a locked facility but still using, it does not arrest the progression of the disease. The prognosis is still the same. So the way I phrase that oftentimes is everyone quits using drugs eventually. My hope and my goal is for you to quit doing that on this side of the dirt. That is my hope and my wish in that regard. Now, that's not to say that it's fatalistic. In other words, again, just like a predisposition is a predestination, prognosis isn't either. Fortunately, the other thing that we talk about is treatment. So is there treatment for addiction? Fortunately, the answer to that is yes. But I want to be really clear. When I say treatment here, I'm not meaning it in a formal context. Now, it may be that a person needs formal treatment. They may need a medical detox. They may need intensive outpatient or outpatient services or a 28-day program or a 6-month program. They may need something formal to help them in their active addiction to move toward recovery. But here, when I say treatment, I mean anything that arrests the progression of the disease. That might be AA, that might be NA, that might be Al-Anon, that might be the faith community, that might be a rec league or being involved in a gospel choir or a chorale. It can be all kinds of things. Celebrate recovery, rational recovery. It can be all kinds of things that arrest the progression of the disease. The reality is that the majority of people with a substance use disorder don't need formal treatment necessarily, but they are going to need some support if they're going to make and sustain changes. That really is important. And if a person is in active addiction, We have a word for people who are in recovery by themselves. We call it high. That doesn't work. Now, occasionally there is even spontaneous recovery. That's rare, but we all probably know somebody who, after 20 years of smoking cigarettes or 20 years of drinking or 20 years of doing something, woke up one morning and went, I think I'm going to quit today. And they did. Those are rare folks, but they do exist. The challenge is making sure that whatever our pathway of recovery may be, or our support system in our own lives may be, is not something we try to dictate into being someone else's pathway of recovery. So again, oftentimes you'll hear people say things like, I was able to quit after 20 years. I just woke up and quit. If other people want to quit, they can too. Or you'll hear people say, no, you got to get into the rooms, or you're not even in recovery. Or if you're not doing MAT, you're probably not going to stay in recovery. Making sure that we honor multiple pathways is really important when we focus on treatment and the pathway to recovery. There's a ton else I could say there, but in the interest of time, I won't do that. And last but not least, it may be chronic. Is addiction chronic? Well, the short answer to that is yes. And it's not chronic because people don't get better. It's chronic because, well, let me give this example. Like I smoked cigarettes for years. And at the time I quit smoking, I was probably smoking about 3/4 of a pack a day. It took me a little while to get up to smoking that much a day, over a year for sure, to get up to smoking about 3/4, half a pack a day. But if I were tomorrow, at this point, I haven't smoked a cigarette in over 20 years. But if tomorrow I picked up a cigarette and I began smoking again, and I didn't immediately quit, how long do you think it would take me to get back to smoking half a pack to 3/4 of a pack a day? I can assure you it wouldn't be a year. It would probably be a week or two. Most likely. I was never a part-time smoker. It didn't work like that for me. So in that regard, it's considered chronic because if people do have a relapse or a recurrence, they don't tend to pick up where they began. They tend to pick up where they left off. That's also where you see a lot of danger in terms of overdose. People are coming from a locked facility, or they're coming from treatment, or they're coming from a while in recovery, and they think, well, I used to be able to use this much, I ought to still be able to use it, but their tolerance has gone down. So that can be a significant factor as well. So in that regard, when we look at the American Medical Association's definition of a disease, addiction has a cause, use. It has symptoms that are in the DSM. It has a prognosis, what happens untreated, and what may happen if you do have treatment. It also does have treatment, and it is considered a chronic disease. But even if not, it could be an acute disease. Again, that's not a requirement. It just may be in that regard. It meets all the criteria of disease. And so hopefully that lays that to rest, at least that part of the discussion. I will say for myself, I don't even talk about a disease model of addiction because I don't talk about a disease model of cancer. It meets the criteria. And so I don't try to inject uncertainty into something that makes more sense or that meets the criteria. So we talked about the fact that addiction is indeed chronic, but it is not hopeless. There are thankfully ways to intervene, ways to intercede, and people do recover, which is a pretty amazing thing. That's one of the things that keeps me passionate about this profession, is I get front row seats to miracles. I also get front row seats to tragedy sometimes. But wow, isn't it amazing when people do get in long-term recovery? And you can't bet ponies either. Sometimes the one who shows up and they're talking a good game is the one that the next day is gone and they're struggling and they're back out there. And the one who is white knuckling it and you're going, I don't know if they're going to make it. They're the ones who you see in the grocery store 2 years later and they're doing great. Again, I've never been able to predict that. So if we look at that foundation, we really did a deep dive there on biology. Now, clearly, looking at the time frame, we're not going to do that deep of a dive on the rest, but I do want to highlight a few things that are foundational to that model. Psychological liability. What we're really talking about here is a failure of attachment. And this really comes from the work of Heinz Kohut, and then Bowlby and others picked up on it later on. But what he said is that we had three fundamental needs: a narcissistic need, an exhibitionistic need, and a grandiose. And these were like on top of food and shelter and water and those kind of things. Now, when he says narcissistic, he's not talking diagnostically. In fact, if you want to think of it in terms of mythology, that's more where it comes from. Like the myth of Narcissus was that he was super attractive. In fact, he was so attractive that all these people just wanted to hook up with him. And he broke a lot of hearts, and ultimately that caught the attention of a goddess, and it upset her. And so she decided to curse him. She cursed him with this: that the first person that Narcissus saw, he was going to fall in love with. The problem is he got thirsty. He leaned down to get a drink of water and saw his reflection and fell in love with his own reflection. And so when he would lean down to touch the one he loved, or to give a kiss to the one he loved, it would disrupt the water and they would disappear. Ultimately, that's how we got narcissus flowers that grow by the water, but that's neither here nor there. For our purposes today, what we're talking about when we say narcissistic is that we have a need to be mirrored. Again, in biology, we actually have a physiology that's set up for mirroring others. We have mirror neurons, which is why jokes are funnier at the comedy club than they are just out in general. When you walk up to a baby and go, "How you doing, little baby?" and you smile, you expect the baby to smile back. Or if you're talking to your significant other and you're crying, you don't expect them to be smiling at you. That's not how that's supposed to work. We expect people to reflect back to us emotional content. Exhibitionistic. We're not talking here about streaking at the Super Bowl. We're talking about a need to be seen, to be acknowledged, for someone just to acknowledge our presence and know that we're there. And third is grandiose, that we have a grandiose need, a need to be seen as wonderful, as having innate worth and innate value. If you ever want to try out the exhibitionistic piece and see if it's real, if that's really a need, put yourself in a room with the parent of the child's permission, of about a 3 or 4 year old, and make up your mind that no matter what they do, you're not going to respond. This is not going to go well. It's going to start out cute because they'll come up and go, "Watch this," and they'll twirl, or they'll bring you a picture they drew or something like that, and you ignore them. Next step is, "Watch this," and now they're like doing backflips off the back of the couch or tap dancing on a glass top coffee table. And if that doesn't work, they will eventually come up and put a hand on each side of your face and go, "Hey, look right here." We have a need to be acknowledged. A little while back in the United States, one of the biggest complaints of workers was that my boss doesn't know I exist. They come in, they go to their cubicle, they go to their office, they don't say, "Hey, how are you?" Nothing. They don't even know I'm here. So that need to be seen doesn't go away. And grandiose, again, to be seen as wonderful. And what Kohut said is that if we had good enough parenting, not perfect parenting, but if those needs were met often enough, then the result of that was a healthy self-object. That's what we got. In other words, we had a good sense of who we are, what we're about, what our own worth is. We have a good sense of those things. That was the idea behind that. On the other hand, if those needs were not met through not good enough parenting, what I expected him to say was, then we have an unhealthy self-object. Like linguistically, that made sense to me. But what he said instead is that when those three needs are not met often enough, instead what we have is shame. Now, if you want to do an incredible deep dive into shame and shame studies, I would point you toward the work of Brene Brown. She's a researcher on that. She has podcasts, she has books, TED Talks, you name it. And she's phenomenal. She's one of the few researchers who can still speak people. So that's always a plus. That's always a benefit. But shame at its core is the idea that I'm not good enough, that I'm not something enough, that I'm not adequate. That could be a wide range of things. That I'm not smart enough, that I'm not pretty enough, that I'm not athletic enough, that I'm not strong enough, that I'm not black enough, that I'm not woman enough, that I'm not man enough, that I'm not gay enough, that I'm not straight enough, that I'm not religious enough. Whatever it is that I'm not enough of is at its heart shame. Now, shame has some physiological repercussions as well. It actually like lowers our levels of serotonin, which means we don't feel okay and talking to us about it probably isn't going to fix that very easily. That becomes an issue for some as well. But the experience of someone who is incredibly shame driven, those needs were not met when they were young, is that the example I use is like this. It's like driving and pouring down rain. I mean, like torrential pouring down rain, to the point where you're just following the taillights in front of you and hoping they don't go off a cliff. You're stressed out, you're tense. And in the middle of that pouring down torrential rain, you have the best 2 seconds of driving in all of humanity, because in that rain, you go under a bridge. Wow, that's beautiful. Best 2 seconds of driving in all of driving, as far as I'm concerned. For the person who is incredibly shame-based, the act of using a substance oftentimes is the bridge. They go under for just a second. The problem is that the storm is raging, it didn't disappear, and they're coming out on the other side of the bridge. In fact, if you want to bear down on that analogy further, basically addiction in that scenario would be deciding to park under the bridge, if you want to think of it like that, and just wait out the storm. The problem is, in this case, the storm isn't going anywhere. So in that regard, we talk about a psychological liability. It's a liability in that we didn't get the deposits in being mirrored, seen, and seen as wonderful as we would have wanted to receive. It also leads to shame and ideas about shame, like that at my core, I'm bad. And so I have to earn my value. To be good, I have to do good and do a lot of it. It has other things that come with that, like a fear of punishment or that need for constant external approval. Do you ever get that client who's like always at your door needing some affirmation? That's part of where that comes from. Or nagging comparisons. If you put a smiley face on the negative drug screen of one client and not another, they notice that stuff because they're looking to see, am I being treated equally? Am I really acknowledged in the same way? It can lead to people pleasing as well, and can even lead to a host of other things other than addiction that are nonetheless not particularly healthy. Think perfectionism, workaholism, some of those things that come into play as well. And if we're not careful, we will shame the shamed and then wonder why they don't get better. What do I mean by that? Well, a person comes in to see us because they have a substance use disorder. We give them a drug test after they've been there for a month and they test positive, and we're like, man, I really thought you were going to have a negative test this time. Or they look at our facial expressions and they see anything other than compassion. That becomes a real significant issue as well. We also use phrases sometimes, like I heard early in the beginning when we were talking about how people at the grocery store might refer to people. They throw out the word junkie. Again, I hear people in treatment centers throwing out the word, we work with addicts. I don't work with addicts. I work with people who have an addiction. The best way to refer to people is as people. If you ever want to dehumanize or devalue someone, what you do is you call them something other than human, whether that's a racial epithet, or whether that's a gender slur, or whether that's any number of things, or they go to prison. You make them a number. Or you go to a concentration camp and they assign a number. We dehumanize when we are trying to make someone's value seem less, like they are less than. The only other thing I'll say about shame is that it's always a gift. And what I mean by that is nobody comes into the world thinking they are less than. We are taught, sometimes by family, sometimes by peers, sometimes by society or the community or the culture, that we are less than in some capacity. We'll circle back around to that in a little bit, but shame is always a gift. It's always something that's taught. In fact, children sort of come into the world thinking they are the center of the universe. So that's a little bit different. Social isolation. Again, if you think about it in terms of addiction, we hear that all the time, that there is in fact a degree of social isolation. This matters because we need each other. In fact, I don't know if y'all ever do this. I get caught up watching like shows about Alaska at when I should be sleeping at 1 a.m. sometimes, or something like that. I'm watching some show about Alaska, and one of the things I always like about them is these people seem like, wow, they're just so independent. And in one sense, that's true. But they're talking about their independence while they're riding on a snowmobile. You didn't build that snowmobile. You didn't get the oil out of the ground and process it into gasoline to run the snowmobile. The house that you're living in, you might have helped construct it, but you didn't process the metal out of ore in the ground. In fact, if you look at the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's a great line in there where essentially they say, I figure after all the wisdom that I've gained in my life, I figure I have just about enough to build a toaster. Like we really are not independent. We are interdependent. In fact, there are species of animal who go their whole life and never see another of their kind, and they're perfectly okay with that. If you go to the store and you see like the little fish in a cup, the betas that they sell there at the store, those animals are actually called Siamese fighting fish. The scientific name is beta splendens. The reason they're called Siamese fighting fish is that if you put two males in a cup together, one of them is going to die. They will fight to the death until one of them is gone. In the wild, they don't see each other. And if they do, they fight to the death just like that. They live in like rice paddies with like small pools, and that's where they reside. Even when they procreate, they don't see each other. Like the females come along and lay their eggs on top of the water. They go their way. Later on, the male comes along, fertilizes them, goes his way. They never see another of their kind, and they do perfectly all right. How long does it take a human being to get to that level of independence? We don't. If you said 18, it's because you don't have children who are older than 18 yet, or you haven't really, in some cases, been honest about your own upbringing. The reality is that we never outgrow the need for other people. We have a need socially, but when we're isolated and looking for a way to fit in, substances seem oftentimes to be an easy way to do that. The idea of drugs as a social lubricant. In fact, for most people, the first time they used a substance, this isn't true for everybody, but for most people, they were with somebody they liked, they respected, or they wanted to hook up with, one of the three. And they go, hey, do you use? And because they liked, respected, or wanted to hook up with a person, they either said yes or no, but I'm willing to try. And they did. So let's use the example of marijuana, which I know none of you used, but we know people, right? And so in this scenario, they hand the person a blunt or a joint or a bowl or whatever they're using to smoke. The person breathes it into their lungs. What I can guarantee you is the first time it was breathed into their lungs, they did not want it. Their body did not want it. How do I know that? Because their body tried to kick it out. Crying, tears going down the cheek. They're passing it around. It comes around the second time. When it comes around the second time, they still haven't felt the buzz yet. Like they haven't felt any good feeling from it. And they hit it a second time. Why would they do that? Because there was somebody they like, they respect, or they want to hook up with. That social isolation primes the pump for addiction. When people we all have a need to belong, but when people don't have that or haven't experienced that as strongly, it is another risk factor in terms of addiction. That belonging also just ties in, and this will just connect a couple of dots and we'll move on. That limbic system, another thing that it gives us the capacity to do is to bond with others, to connect with other people. In fact, our amygdala responds more strongly to a human face than it does to a loaded gun. And then on the surface, that may not make a lot of sense, but if you think about it, we grow up in our formative years, in our developmental years, and I'm actually doing a training in this same series in December that focuses heavily on adolescence, where we go into a lot more detail about that. We grow up during our formative years as little people in a land of giants. Like everybody's taller than us, bigger than us, stronger than us. They have the resources. They tell us what to eat. They tell us what time to go to bed. We grow up in a land of giants. It makes a lot of sense that we learn to attend to the faces of others. That's a really powerful thing that is physiologically pushed into us as well. That social context is huge, and that social context also reinforces the shame. Again, I mentioned racial epithets and all those kinds of things, or racial slurs. What do we call people with addiction? That goes back to that person first language. Well, they call them junkies, they call them addicts, they call them crackheads, pill heads, weed heads, meth heads. Not sure why it's always head, but that seems to be a popular way to go. That really gets into the social context as well. So oftentimes society treats people with addiction as like they're throwaway people. I've literally talked to EMTs who goes, I've revived them twice already this week. How many times do I got to revive them? My answer is always the same number of times that you would want your son or daughter revived. They're a human being and they're worthy of dignity. That to me is sort of a foundational thing to all of that. All right, we're going to skip through some of this. And those notes are there. I never have delusions that I'm going to hit everything on every slide. I will just say that the end, I really like this quote. We can change what we know by appealing to reason. We can change how we behave some of the time by learning new skills. But we can change who we are and how we respond only by allowing ourselves to be loved and to love unconditionally over time. Love is the only antidote I've ever found for shame. And since you do want to be careful with that, you don't want to start telling your clients that you love them necessarily. That's probably not a good thing, because love means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Insert the word unconditional positive regard here, and you have the idea that we need to be able to meet that grandiose need of the client, to see them as wonderful. And spiritually bankrupt. All right, spiritually bankrupt. First of all, when you start talking about spirituality, it can get a little risky. So let me take a second to break down the difference between religion and spirituality. They don't even come from the same word. Religion comes from religio, which means duty or obligation or rule. In other words, these are the things you must do in order to adhere to this religion. This is how you live a righteous life. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. It tells us how to live. It almost always has a text. The only exception I know to that is the Aboriginal language, rather the Aboriginal religion, where it really is the landscape is the text. But almost all of them have it, and they usually are consequences involved. In other words, whether that's the 10 Commandments or whether that's karma, there are consequences involved regarding whether or not you follow the rules of that religion. Religion is also typically divisive. If you don't believe me, look around your town and you will probably find a First Baptist church, a Second Baptist church, a Third Baptist church, a First Methodist, a Second Methodist. So even among people who agree on what their general faith is, the particulars of that faith tend to get divisive. Same in Islam. If you happen to be one version versus another, or Buddhism, there are different variations thereof. Religion tends to be divisive. In fact, if you want to make your Thanksgiving turkey taste different, if you celebrate Thanksgiving, have a discussion about religion around the table. And unless you focus on the things you share in common, that will quickly break down. That doesn't mean religion is a bad thing. So sometimes people get the sense that I'm like pitting religion against spirituality, and I'm not. I know people who are deeply religious and deeply spiritual. I know people who are deeply spiritual and are irreligious. And I know people who are deeply religious, but not the least bit spiritual. So what is the distinction? Well, spirituality comes from the phrase spiritus, or the word spiritus, which means breath or breathing. Now, I have a choice regarding whether or not I adhere to the tenets of a religion. I don't have a lot of choice about breathing. In fact, when my kids were little, they would occasionally do that. I'm going to hold my breath thing. I never got excited or concerned about that at all, because the reality is I'm going to win that fight every time, because eventually if you hold your breath, you're going to pass out. And when you pass out, you're going to fall down. And guess what? You're going to breathe. For years, that's how you measured whether or not life was there. It was the essence of life. Some of you, in terms of hiring, may have heard the phrase the mirror test. Can they fog up a mirror? That's because that's how one of the ways they used to test for life was the person breathing. It's also part of what gives human life its unique meaning. So again, those two things are not synonymous. So when we say bringing spirituality into this equation, don't get nervous about that or think you're about to start proselytizing or trying to convert people. That is not at all what we're talking about. In fact, this model is the best one that I found to really address that. And what this really is meant to spell out is that these are 4 ways that humans express their spirituality that isn't exactly identical to animals. So again, the issue here isn't whether, I don't know, dogs have a soul. The issue is that this is how humans express their spirituality in some regards. And these actually were derived, if you're interested in the background, they were actually sort of distilled out of the 12 steps as part of where they came from. So when you talk about a spiritual program, that's part of what we're talking about. The first of those is choice. And the bottom line of choice is anytime you make an excuse, no matter how good the excuse sounds, you're giving away part of your personal power. In other words, if my boss called and said, hey, I need to talk to you at 10:30 this morning, and I said to them, I can't talk to you then because I'm doing a training at that time. Can I call you at 11? That sounds really reasonable. But I also just lied to my boss because what I said is I can't. The truth is, I could have. I mean, I could have called Lee this morning and said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to do the training, or I'm going to have to cut it short, or we could have done a quick break, or we could have done something. But what I said was, I can't do that. A more accurate statement would have been, I appreciate your request. However, I have a prior obligation that I choose to prioritize over it at this time. I'm not saying it is ever smart to say that to your boss. I'm just saying that that's more honest. I'm honoring my own choice, my own volition, my own potency, if you will, in that regard. The problem is that when I make a choice, any choice, there is always risk inherent in it. If I came on today and I said, hi, my name is James Campbell and I'm a Democrat, some of you would be like, all right. Some of you would be like, oh Lord, here we go. Or if I came on and said, hi, my name is James Campbell and I'm a Republican, some of you would be like, all right. Some of you would be like, oh no, here we go. Anytime you own a decision, there are going to be people who judge you for it, people who like you. It's going to create an in group and an out group in many cases. That becomes sort of part of that. The key is, are you taking risks and making choices that are going to help you grow, or are they going to actually hinder your growth? Are they growth producing, or are they growth reducing? And I would actually say, and this is sort of that third pillar and making a transition to that, the greatest risk any of us could ever choose to take is the risk to be 100% authentic and real with another person. Let me give you an example. I really like the movie Gladiator, right? Not everybody does. You don't have to, that's fine. I really like the movie Gladiator. The characters are very determined. They're very tenacious. They're pretty shrewd. They're a little bit vengeful, but not all good qualities. Russell Crowe played that role. I don't have any idea if Russell Crowe has any of those traits. No idea. I don't know if he does or if he doesn't. He's playing a role. He's playing a part. And oftentimes we get caught up in playing parts as well, don't we? We play the part of a counselor or a mom or a dad or a spouse or whatever. Like, we get so caught up playing the role that we're not necessarily always being authentic and being real in all the cases. If you go on a first date, are you being real and authentic? Chances are pretty good no. People aren't generally real on a first date. The same reason they're not real at a job interview. They want the job. They're trying to get hired, if you will. But if a person really is real, they're honest, they're authentic, and they're loved and embraced for it, someone sees their worth. Isn't that an awe-inspiring or a wonderful thing? And in this case, awe is just something we don't have a box for, something transcendent, something that we don't have an easy framework for. Some people feel that when they watch the sunrise or the sunset over the ocean, or they go to the mountains, or their child was born, they didn't have a box for it. It just was greater than anything they imagined or was outside. In terms of physiology, it was novel. The nucleus accumbens is going crazy, right? That when we're exercising and doing those things, that is a spiritual process. Well, why does that matter in the context of addiction? Well, these four things are the exact four things that addiction steals from us. In fact, in the beginning, it promises these things, and in the end, it steals them away. For instance, in the beginning, nobody's going to tell me what to do. I make my own choices. You can't tell me I can't get high. Choice. In the end, what does it do to your choice? I realized that I was powerless, right? That becomes an issue. Do you take risks in active addiction? Well, yeah, but they're not growth producing. They reduce your growth. In fact, they'll reduce it down sometimes to a 6x6 cell. It doesn't tend to help you to grow. Relationally, again, we already covered the fact that a lot of times people began using because they were trying to fit in with a group or trying to impress someone or connect with someone. In the end, that's exactly what gets robbed. You used to have a bad day and you called your mom. Now you have a bad day and you call your dealer. Or you used to go out and celebrate something with your friends. Now you just stop off at the bar. Or you're not going to the Super Bowl party unless the alcohol is going to be there. And all in wonder. Eventually it gets to the point where you can't even imagine having a sense of wonder without the drug present. Like, that's just not even a thing. And so in that sense, it is very much the case that addiction is, in a sense, a counterfeit spirituality, and recovery is, in a sense, the process of getting that back. So when we look at that, I hope that gives you like a pretty comprehensive puzzle box. Now, again, there are other pieces of that in terms of experience, in terms of trauma, intergenerational trauma. All of those different pieces play a role and they play a function. But all of that is the puzzle box. And the problem is that Jeff George is too good of a mentor, because in the midst of teaching me all of these things, he was also teaching me this fact that is fundamental from research. People are more motivated to work for what they want than they are to avoid what they don't. Let me say that again. People are more motivated to work toward what they want than they are to avoid what they don't. Now, when I first heard that, I kind of thought that was a no-brainer, yes. But then I started actually listening to things I sometimes said to clients. Not real proud of these, but I'm just going to be honest. I tend to approach things with some humor and not always helpfully some sarcasm. And so I occasionally, particularly early in my career, would say things like, "Are you trying to lose your children? Like, do you not like having a driver's license?" That kind of a thing. And what I started to hear is that I oftentimes was focusing on what the client did not want. It's a very different conversation to go, "Are you trying to lose your kids?" versus saying to them, "Look, you've been coming here for 6 weeks and it's not easy to get here. I know you've had to catch rides and do everything else. You've come here for 6 weeks because I know you want to be a great mom, because you want to be a great dad. But right now there's this chemical barrier between you and your kids. Can we figure out together how to work past that? How do we get past this barrier?" That's a very different conversation. My problem was, and I brought this back to Jeff, uh, is that our addiction is not really ideally the focus of our treatment. If we're more motivated to work toward what we want than avoid what we don't, then why are we spending all of our time talking about addiction, which we don't want? And when I look at your model, Jeff, I love the fact that it gave me the puzzle box. But the fact of the matter is, I don't want anything on your list. I don't want biological vulnerability or psychological liability or social isolation. Can I mess with your model? And he sort of just non-committally said, "Sure, if you want to, go for it." I honestly think he thought that would be the end of it. He didn't know me as well yet at that point. So I went back and began to work with this model and rework it into a framework, a holistic framework for recovery. What if, instead of focusing on biological vulnerability, we begin to focus on biological resiliency? And how do we cultivate that? What if, instead of psychological liabilities, those things that we didn't get enough of, what if we start to focus on psychological assets? How do we make investments or deposits into mirroring, seeing, and seeing as wonderful those that we serve? Or instead of social isolation and focusing on that, how do we begin to cultivate social support and build some recovery capital? What do we do with that? In terms of spiritual bankruptcy, which was Jeff's word, how do we begin to cultivate spiritual abundance in the sense of we're trying to generate more agency, a person owning their choices, a person taking risks that produce growth and building healthy relationships and having more awe and wonder in their lives? How do we begin to do that? And what experiences would it take? How do we go about cultivating that? And so ultimately, what that resulted in is a model of positive recovery. And essentially, it boils down to 4 tasks. And really, when I'm doing clinical work, I view almost everything through the lens of these tasks that facilitate that movement from an active addiction to an active recovery. How do we do that clinically? How do we help someone to move from a biological vulnerability to biological resiliency? How do we help them move from the liability to the assets, the isolation to the support, the bankruptcy to the abundance? How does it happen? Like, how do we cultivate the experiences, the relationships? How do we help them to do that? And so this is like just a brief worksheet that I made up. There's nothing magic there. You can certainly make your own, although this will be in handouts if you get those. Feel free to use it if it's useful. But when I'm working with a client and they talk about some of the areas that they have, whatever that is, if there's family history, if there's this is an area of shame, if this is I don't really have the friends, or I don't, everybody I know gets high. How do we begin to actually focus in on those? This is almost like a treatment plan planning sheet, or an IPOC, individual plan of care planning sheet for me. Because I really believe that at any time in a person who has experienced active addiction and substance use disorder, there's somewhere on a continuum between recurrence and recovery. How do we help them move more and more toward recovery over time? Well, I think that there's some actual actions that we could take. So for a little bit here, I want you in the chat to take a moment and tell me, what are some things from a physiological standpoint, biologically, that might help support someone in building some biological resiliency? How do we work with our clients to help them cultivate greater health, greater wellness, greater resiliency biologically? Take a second and put some ideas in the chat, if you don't mind.
Exercise.
And if you don't mind, let me know some of what you see there as they start to come in.
Exercise, eating healthy, self-care.
Beautiful. Beautiful examples.
Good sleep, prayer, a good support system, therapy, taking a shower daily, building recovery capital, support network, employment, more awareness of the body's reactions.
Fantastic. Great list. The list I'll put up next is also not by any means comprehensive, so I don't want you to get lost in that. These are just some ideas. What about medication compliance? Again, that could be MAT, that could be commingling disorders, like if they need a SSRI, or it could be glucophage for diabetes, or it could be lisinopril for high blood pressure. We know in active addiction, complying with medications is probably not very consistent. How do we talk about that with our clients? Do they have a physician? Do they have insurance to get a physician? Do they have nutrition? Do they have the means to get food? Exercise, sleep hygiene can be a part of that. What about just healthy lifestyle changes? What are some things that would help them with that? Knowing their own body, knowing their triggers is a part of that. We didn't get into it, and again, it's a little past the scope of this training, but when you encounter a trigger, what happens is, in anticipation, your body gives a bump of dopamine. Then it overcorrects and it drops a little bit low, and that's where a craving comes from. So helping clients understand those things, and understand that when faced with a trigger, it is easier to get away from it than to stay in its presence and not use. Some of those kinds of things can be huge to helping clients begin to conceptualize that. Now, obviously, we're probably not doing all of these things in our office, but we do case management, don't we? Or we make referrals and linkages. Those are things that are part of what hopefully we're doing when our clients come to us. When we're doing a biopsychosocial, and in my case, I include spiritual assessment, that's part of what we're looking for, is how do we help meet all these needs? I've never, in 27 years of doing this work, had a client that came to me with a problem, singular. Problems don't rise solo, they ride in packs. So how do we begin to address holistically the things that the client is going through the door with? How about psychological liability? How do we help clients to feel or to be mirrored, seen, and seen as wonderful? How do we make some deposits, or help them find places to make those deposits? What could we do in that regard in the chat? You might be being shy, or you might be like me and like I'm a 3-4 finger typer.
Identify strengths.
How could we do that for our clients?
Identify strengths. What is going well? Encourage journaling, participate in community service, daily rituals such as meditation.
Absolutely. Those are all positive ones, all good ones. But let's even get a little bit more into that and think about it in terms of clinical skill. Well, let's start out structurally. How long could someone sit in the lobby of your office without someone speaking to them? Are they being seen? Are they being acknowledged? Or could they theoretically come in, sit down in your lobby and spend 3 hours there and then walk out and no one have said hello or checked in on them? Those kind of things really do make a difference. Um, Also, if you think about motivational interviewing. In motivational interviewing, we literally call one of the skills that we use reflections, don't we? That's mirroring. We're literally letting them know that they're seen, that they're acknowledged, that they're heard. If you're humanistic in your approach in terms of psychology, that's very much in tune with unconditional positive regard and Carl Rogers, and that we really do see the worth and the value in those that we serve. That we do mirror the affect if we're doing group work or individual work. If the group has a really heavy group, that we're not sitting there smiling at them. We're helping them know that we mirror them, see them, and seeing them as wonderful. That we validate them. That we do affirmations. Again, that's very consistent with MI. All of those are different pieces of that. Sort of bridging that gap a little bit is helping them find places where they are acknowledged, where they are seen, where they are seen as having worth, connecting them with places that are going to be non-shaming, that are really going to be supportive for them. It might include some family therapy as well, when they're open to that and when the family is open to that. That's one of the things I love to bring in as well, even though working with families is messy. It's also very, very powerful when done well and when done effectively. So those are just a few ideas about that, a few ideas of how to begin to work and to make some deposits in that camp. How do you help them begin to identify their strengths? And some of these you do anyway, probably, like reframes like, I was always hustling out there. Well, you know what that is? That's being resourceful, and you're going to need that in your recovery. So having those reframes that are there and reaffirm things in a positive light can be really powerful for that person. So again, sort of bridging the gap from that psychological to the social. Likewise, how do we help a person move from social isolation or not having a lot of social support to having more social support? How can we as clinicians, how can we as peer support, how can we as human service professionals help someone who is feeling isolated or may be isolated? They burned a lot of bridges in their addiction in some cases. Find and connect to support. Put some thoughts in the chat. How do we do that? How do we cultivate that connection for them?
While we're waiting for the last question that you asked, the examples given were meet them where they are, work on self-regulation and self-talk, seek places that are supportive and value, recognize them for their contributions, might be volunteering or something like that. And then for this current question, yes, you must chase your recovery like you chased your addiction.
Absolutely. So, and you're definitely trying to find ways to connect them to some support. As I said earlier, we have a word for people in recovery by themselves. We call it high. So where do they find a support? What is that going to look like? Well, there's a ton of places that may be. It may involve formal treatment. That can be part of their support early on. The key is, because addiction is chronic and most of our treatment settings are not, meaning we're treating for 6 weeks a chronic disease and then wondering why people aren't getting better as much as we would like. Well, it's a flawed model. But because we don't necessarily have the ability to change that overnight, what we need to be sure we're doing is connecting people with longer term supports than what they're going to get in our treatment. That might be the recovery community. That might be, again, it might be a fellowship. It might be AA. It might be NA. It might be Al-Anon, Celebrate Recovery, Rational Recovery, Smart Recovery. It may be getting connected to a faith community. Now, I do put a disclaimer there, that one that's going to be supportive. Oftentimes I'll ask somebody, how are you going to stay in your recovery? And they say, oh, I'm going to go to church. And I go, weren't you going to church when you were getting high? Well, yeah. Okay, well, if you were going to church while you were getting high, doing church the way that you did it is not going to be helpful for you. Like, you have to have somebody there. It may or may not be a pastor, but you're going to have somebody there who, when they say to you, how are you doing? You can look them straight in the eyes and go, man, I am struggling today. I'm feeling like a mug. Can you help me out? Want to go get some coffee? Hopefully you have somebody you can have that conversation with. and find some social support with. In addition, finding things that are shared hobbies can be a huge part of that. Finding people that you can connect with, that you have things in common with. Because the reality is that nobody's going to, sometimes you'll get that person, you say, what are you going to do in your recovery? They say, I'm going to stay in the house. That's awesome. What are you going to do the second day? Nobody wants to stay in their house forever, or at least very few want to stay in their house forever. So are there civic groups? Are there sports that they can get involved in? Again, a rec league or just a group of friends that play ball or something that you can get involved with. Where do you begin to find that? It may be in the workplace, maybe. It may be family. Now, the thing I do want to say here is you want to be cautious, because not all places you think will be supportive will be. Some families can be incredibly supportive. Some families are where they learn how to get high. Likewise, some workplaces could be really supportive of someone in their recovery. Other workplaces, they may expect you to work 18-hour shifts and, hey, you do what you got to do to stay up that long and be working, but we need you on. So we can't automatically assume, but our goal is not to prescribe these to those that we serve, is to ask, where can you find some social supports that is their pathway to recovery that we're working with them on. All right, spirituality. How do we help people move from spiritual bankruptcy, that sense that they're disempowered, to having greater spiritual abundance? How do we begin to connect those dots for people? Again, sometimes you'll get some pushback on that because people are like, well, I'm powerless in my addiction. That's the truth. But you learn to become powerful in your recovery. How do you make that transition? What do you think? What thoughts do you have in the chat on that one?
While we wait for replies, one of the things mentioned on the last slide was peer support.
Peer support is a phenomenal way to do that. That also ties back to that social as well. So it really does kind of touch on both of those. But having the installation of hope as a clinical therapeutic tool almost can't be overstated. It really is a powerful, powerful force. If people don't think they can get better, and nobody around them thinks they can get better because they already told them, you're just going to keep doing what you're doing, they tend to believe what they're told. It's a very different conversation when they come in and we say, you know what, I've worked with a lot of people who are in similar places to where you are, and I've seen a lot of them make some amazing changes and are doing really well. That's a powerful statement. That installation of hope is a part of that. Any others?
I was muted, sorry. Career support, empowering individuals to develop a recovery plan, helping them find the beauty of life and things around them.
Excellent, excellent. Those are both, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Informed choice, self-determination.
Absolutely. And again, this is where some of those skills that we talked about before really do make a difference. Like, we talked about learning some skills to calm down the horse. Well, this is a great place when you start focusing on like CBT or RBT to really do a deep dive into things that you do have a choice about, that it isn't just fatalistic. Bringing some of those things to the fore isn't in and of itself curative, but it provides the opportunity to do things differently, for people to be intentional in their approach. Other places that people may find some of these may include things like that are religious practice, more like prayer or meditation or religious services. Those can be a part of that. For some people, 12 steps are a part of that. Finding that acceptance can be a piece of the puzzle. Finding that connection relationally can be an aspect of that. Giving yourself a chance to just breathe for a minute. All of those can be some, and these are not things that I sat in a room and came up with, by the way. These are things that clients have told me over time that are part of their own program, part of their own recovery plans that they activate, things that they are doing that really help support them in their spiritual arena. They may not all work for me, and they may not all resonate with me, or they may not all resonate with another client, but it at least gives a place to start. And if we can begin to focus on the things that we want, or the things that the client wants in particular, how is it that we can help them move from that active addiction to a healthy recovery and greater wellness over time? How do we help them make those transitions become a part of that? Again, just another thing that is a resource. Again, no specific magic there, but if you're more CBT oriented, you like to give homework or you like to kind of do some journaling that was mentioned a minute ago, but not everyone's going to sit and do creative writing. This is a tool to use along those lines that really does check in those 4 domains. Again, it's not an end all be all. Feel free to edit it, toss it, use it if it's useful. But it's a way of trying to check in with folks and give them some supports in between. And ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, after 27 years, there are really 2 things that are primarily therapeutic in my take. And one of those is experience. The experience of being cared about, the experience of being nurtured, the experience of being seen as wonderful, and relationship. In fact, if you look at the work of Scott Miller, he did a great job of documenting the fact that actually the therapeutic rapport is, as far as the clinician is concerned, the most powerful tool you have. It isn't technique, it isn't which theoretical model you follow, that the therapeutic rapport is actually much more powerful than those attributes. So that using those things, that experience and those relationships to really impact and engage those that we serve and begin to encourage them to take steps between those 2 different ways of being, to move further from recurrence more toward recovery, and framing it in a positive way can be really powerful. If all we do in terms of treatment is get people together and talk about addiction for 90 minutes and then send them home and say good luck, what we've done in many cases is brought them in and triggered them and sent them back out. What if the emphasis is on recovery? What if the emphasis is on building those things that support the overall health and wellness of those that we serve? I do want to leave some time for thoughts, ideas, and questions here at the end, and there may be some in the chat. My contact information is in the slide, so I'm not going to leave that up. I'm going to stop sharing and pull it up so I can actually see some faces. Y'all are probably way, way more interesting than the slide deck is. So let me do that. Also, while I do that, I am going to put into the chat the evaluation that I mentioned earlier. Now, this is not to be confused with the evaluation for Kentucky Systems of Care. This is how at SATTC, who I work for, we keep our funding. It's literally about 2 minutes long. And so if you would do that, it helps us basically continue to provide trainers is really at the heart of it. It also keeps me honest. So I don't go, yeah, I did this great training the other day. There were 3,000 people in it. It was amazing. So it helps keep me honest as well and accountable. So that link is there when you need it. It won't kick you out of Zoom to click on it. But if you do have questions or if there are ones in the chat, I would love to take a minute to address those and to make sure that if there's anything that I can do to assist and support you, I want to.
We do have a question in the chat. And also, since we're in webinar mode, you can't see all of their faces. How can someone determine what they are low in, such as dopamine, gamma, etc.?
There are actual tests that they can do for that already. Those have been around. They're not usually covered by insurance, just a disclaimer there. But you can usually get those tested out. Typically, even a family physician can do that or send the tests off to have that done. The utility of it may be a couple of things. It may be, again, if you're concerned about what a primary drug might be or what you might be more inclined to gravitate toward, that could be an issue. In theory, that might be a concern. But the other I would put out there is if there is a pre-existing condition. Again, if someone does have, for instance, depression and their serotonin levels are lower, that might be a way of finding that out early as well, or being able to intervene as well. Sort of like what I talked about cocaine doing to dopamine, where it keeps more down in the synapse. An SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, does the same thing for serotonin. It keeps it down in the synapse so that it elevates the mood. It's an imperfect analogy, but for me, serotonin is like Crush in Finding Nemo. Like it's like, dude, it's all right. That's kind of serotonin. And if you're not have enough serotonin, you will not believe it's all right, no matter what anyone says to you. So keeping that serotonin down there can be really helpful for someone who may, for instance, struggle with depression. In that regard, cocaine is a SDRI, a selective dopamine reuptake inhibitor, if you want to think of it that way, but you cannot get it as prescribed.
Okay, here's a question in Q&A. When you look at people who overdose after treatment, with the assumption that the person's tolerance has reduced and that has contributed to the overdose. Also, if tolerance is a factor, should we view addiction in terms of progression instead of cessation? Do you want me to read them individually?
Let me take the first one there. And the first one is that it's a risk factor. In other words, I don't think it's a safe assumption to think that their tolerance went down and that's why they overdosed, especially not now. One thing that's very different now is that in the past, when someone overdosed, you kind of assumed, or you typically knew what they overdosed from. If someone had been using heroin and they overdosed, clearly they probably overdosed on heroin. What we see a lot of now is people overdosing on fentanyl when they didn't even know they were taking fentanyl. I literally have a friend who lost their grandson because he smoked a blunt and it had been laced with fentanyl. He had no idea, like he wasn't into opioids at all. Like he smoked weed, like that was his thing, but he had no idea about opioids at all. Somebody had laced it and he died of an overdose for a drug he didn't even know he was taking. So a lot of times you're seeing that now as things are cut with. Also, I know meth is a huge issue. And one of the things that happens a lot now is people are combining, and this has been around for a long time, but people are increasingly combining methamphetamine with opioids, which has a synergistic effect. In other words, it's not like 1 + 1 = 2, it's like 1 + 1 = 6. It amplifies it. And it sometimes makes it so that they don't feel the effects of one or the other, and so they end up overdosing in that way. So it wouldn't be safe to assume that it was just because of tolerance change. I lost the second part of that question, and I apologize.
No, if tolerance is a
I
factor,
can't hear you.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, if tolerance is a factor, should we view addiction in terms of progression instead of cessation?
If I understand that question correctly, and if I'm not answering, feel free to chime in and let me know that. What I would say is it probably depends on whether you're coming from an abstinence or a harm reduction model. And why I say that is probably when you talk about progression and backing off of use, some people see that as part of recovery. There are people who would say to you, I've been in recovery 6 years for methamphetamine, but I still smoke weed. Is that person in recovery? Well, again, if you're abstinence based, the answer to that is clearly no. If you are on probation, the answer to that is probably no from the probation officer. But in terms of the impact in that person's life, you may well see gains in terms of their functioning, gains in terms of them getting healthier. If you're a harm reduction mindset person, if you really do view addiction in terms of harm reduction and recovery in terms of harm reduction, then probably yes, looking at it more from the progression side and slowing that down and doing things to help that person gain that back. If it's helpful, this is how I define recovery. You can make it really complicated, and there's some really great definitions out there from SAMHSA and NIDA and others. But for my purposes, when I'm talking to a client in the room, they don't care about SAMHSA and NIDA. I say recovery, from my perspective, is the process of trying to recover or get back whatever it is you lost while in active use. For some people, their recovery is their driver's license. For some people, their recovery is regaining custody of their kids. For some people, recovery is getting their freedom back. For some people, it's self-worth and self-esteem. The key there is that I can't dictate what their recovery is and what their recovery is about. And what might motivate me, or what I would think would be motivating for them, may not be the thing that motivates them in their recovery. In that regard, it's really important that we not try to dictate another person's recovery to them. It just doesn't work very well. There really are truly multiple pathways of recovery. One other footnote I'll put there to tie a couple of things together is I mentioned whether you tend to be more harm reduction in your mindset or whether you tend to be more abstinence based. And I personally really want to honor all pathways of recovery. one of the things that I've seen recently is 10 years ago, if somebody walked into a 12-step fellowship and they said they were on MAT, they almost certainly were going to be told they weren't in recovery. If they were on methadone or if they were on Suboxone. First of all, that's not in alignment with the literature of AA or NA, but literature and practice don't always line up. Now, however, fast forward 10 years to the present. Now what I tend to see is when someone stands up and they say, for me, recovery is abstinence-based, I do that through the 12 steps. Oftentimes they're marginalized today in the same way MAT was in the past. And so I don't want to lose any of the voices of recovery. I want, to me, whatever pathway someone takes to get into the house of recovery is the path I want them to take. Ideally, do I personally prefer some more than others? Yeah, but it's not my recovery. I have to be humble enough to let it be theirs. And that's usually a good place to start.
I think that's a great reminder. I recently had a friend in recovery tell
I
me,
lost your audio.
can you hear me now?
I can't.
I think there's a delay between my computer and yours. I said, that's
Gotcha.
a great reminder because I recently had a friend in recovery tell me that she was shamed for not using this other person's form of recovery. And I think everybody has their own, and you have to be respectful of that.
Absolutely.
Okay. I am not seeing any other questions. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us again. I think this is your third year with System of Care Academy, and we appreciate you every time you come. And for everybody still with us, don't forget in the coming weeks that you'll receive a link for a session evaluation, but also in the chat is the session evaluation that James needs you to complete for his job. 2 different evaluations. The one for his job is important for him. So thank you everybody for being with us, and we will see you next time.